Hey, what's up? Welcome back to Project Freelance. This week on the podcast, I am talking to my friend Brandon Wynn. He is a rocket photographer. If you guys remember a couple seasons back, we had Eric Kuna come on the podcast right before I headed out to a NASASocial event. And if you don't know what NASASocial is, don't worry, we talk about it in this episode. And we talk about rocket photography. That's this week's topic. We are talking to another rocket photographer. And I met Brandon at a NASASocial event, which I'll just explain it now for you guys. It is an event where they bring social media creators together to go behind the scenes of NASA and SpaceX, and it was an absolutely amazing opportunity that I got to be a part of, and Brandon also got to be a part of. And he has since done another NASASocial event, and it has only furthered his growth as a rocket photographer and an aerospace enthusiast. So before we get into this podcast, I just want to let you guys know that it is tax season right now, and I've got some links down in the description to help you guys out, whether you need help tracking your expenses or covering your mileage. And this stuff you can write off. You can write off your car payments. You can write off all of the things that you use to make your work, your freelancing work possible. So there are some links down in the description to help you guys out with that. Tracking mileage is super important as a freelancer, especially as if you drive a lot like I do, or I'm sure Brandon does, because, freelancing, you don't just do it in your little tiny town. You do it all over the place. At least, that's what you should be doing. You should expand your reach from your small town to the big cities and beyond. I freelance all over the world. Every time I travel somewhere, I pick up work or I get a job that allows me to travel somewhere. So yeah, I always write off my mileage, and I have to keep track of my expenses. So if you guys need help with that, links in the description, check it out. But other than that, we are going to go ahead and get started with this episode of Project Freelance. Brandon, can you please introduce yourself and what it is you do to the Project Freelance audience?
My name is Brandon Wynn. I'm the owner of HoverSlam Photography as well as HoverSlamSpace.com. HoverSlam Photography is a freelance photography company that does photos in my local area here in Tampa Bay, Florida, as well as provides photojournalism for my media website as well as other media websites who reach out and ask for photojournalism specifically in the area of rockets, which is my passion.
Okay, so there's a lot I want to talk to you about today, but let's start off with, how did you get into photography in the first place? What got you started?
Well, I'd always kind of been around cameras my entire life, just as a lot of people are, family members just taking amateur pictures. And when I was about 10 years old, my dad, for my birthday, bought me my first camera, which was a little Fujifilm point and shoot camera with, I think it had 200 millimeters of focal length on it. And it was by far like my favorite birthday present I had ever gotten, and could not let it go for weeks and months after I had gotten it, and was just running around taking pictures where I could, and was just really exploring my art at that point in time. Skip forward a couple years ahead, about the age of 16 years old, I got a job here locally at the Clearwater Marine Aquarium as a photographer, taking pictures of the guests as well as the animals at the aquarium. And then about a year after that, I got a job at Zoo Tampa here in Tampa, Florida, where I was able to continue that work. And starting doing training on DSLRs and working with professional photographers who were able to kind of really develop my artistic talent at that point, made me fall further in love with photography. And from that point, I was just hooked.
So you did a lot of like hands-on learning, it sounds like, at these zoos and aquariums. Why did you want to go to I guess, quote unquote, wildlife photography and portraiture? What made you apply for those jobs?
It was that same fun, passionate reaction I had the first time that I got behind my little point and shoot camera that my dad had gotten me. It was this feeling of I see the world through a lens, and I want to be able to capture that and show um, everyone else what I'm able to see and how beautiful the things that are around us are, even the smallest things, and then to the biggest things like rockets.
Yeah. So, did you do any formal studying, like in school, for photography?
I didn't do any formal studying at school. I have not done any college background education regarding photography. I received photography training on the job for the Clearwater Marine Aquarium and Zoo Tampa jobs, but there's no degree backing me up for sure.
Yeah, I was just curious because I've got a lot of self-taught freelancers on this podcast, and so it's just interesting. And I'm always curious to hear about if they have an educational background or if they're fully self-taught, because I want people that listen to this podcast to know that you don't necessarily need to study this stuff in school. You can learn yourself. You can take the initiative, and there's things like YouTube now. Like, I'm sure you didn't have YouTube back then very much because you were younger, but nowadays you don't need to necessarily go to college to get a degree to do the thing that you love to do or that you want to do. So yeah, I just wanted to hear your education background. Let's fast forward. So you started at the aquarium and then you moved to the zoo. What was next for you?
Next for me was buying my first DSLR, which I did about 2 years ago. Got my hands on a Canon 60 Mark II because that was my daily driver at work, and I wanted to continue that at home. So once I did that, I continued to really pursue my art and studied as much photography, still photography, as I possibly could. And actually, back to your note about self-taught photographers, YouTube really was a big asset for me. Doing photos at work. I was able to kind of express a little bit of my own artistic output into the photos, but a lot of it was very standard. This is the kind of photo we need to take of the guest or the animal, and this is what the product needs to look like. So being able to put my own style and my own kind of flair and practicing different kinds of photography, like long exposure photography, nighttime photography, that took kind of doing my research and trying to figure out what my strengths and weaknesses were. And definitely YouTube was a huge asset. Studying other rocket photographers at the time, watching YouTubers like Peter McKinnon and Frono's Photos and all those other guys definitely kind of helped me advance my knowledge and advance my skills. And I just did everything I could to make myself a better photographer without having to shovel over the money to go to school for it.
Yeah. Just a quick side note about the inspirations that you have. So Peter has been mentioned for the last 5 weeks in a row. So if you know him or if you know somebody that knows him, I'm really trying to get him on this podcast. Everybody looks up to the
that
guy,
would be
man.
awesome.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
go ahead.
he's definitely a huge inspiration behind the style of photography that I do. He's awesome, and I would have to credit a lot of my knowledge and my inspiration behind the kind of photography I do to him. He definitely, there was a good 2 month stretch where it was just every day binging Peter McKinnon and kind of trying to emulate his talent, because he's such an awesome guy for sure.
He's like a very cinematic photographer. Like, I think that comes from his background in film as well. You know, he sees the world cinematically.
Which is something that is so, it sounds like it makes sense, but it's something very rare, I think, in the still photography community, is bringing a cinematic value to your photos and just making every single frame, no matter if it's a picture of like a blade of grass, or again, I'm going to keep coming back to the rockets because I think that's kind of as big of a scale as you can kind of get, and just no matter how big or how small it is, making it epic And that's what he really kind of gets out of his photos, and it's something I try and emulate from mine as well.
So let's go and talk about rockets. So how did you? Okay, first, when you were a kid, like living in Florida, did you watch rocket launches frequently, or like what is your background with space and exploration and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I come from a military background family. No aviation, no rocketry. Nobody in my family kind of developed me into somebody who's passionate about aerospace. But yeah, certainly living in Florida, being around the Space Coast and around the things that were going on caught my eye. And specifically at the age of 5, there was one day where my entire family was over at my house, and they were gathered around the TV to watch the Space Shuttle Discovery return to flight mission after the Columbia disaster. Um, and so I came out of my room from playing with my little styrofoam airplane and was like, "What's going on here? What are you guys watching?" And they're like, "Oh, it's a rocket about to go into space, and there's people on it." And I was like, "That's crazy," because you watch these kind of things in sci-fi movies as a kid, and you're like, "Oh yeah, that could never happen." But then I was looking at the TV, and this rocket, the space shuttle, that looked like a plane, was there's telling me about to go into space, and there was people on board of it, and they were going to go to this space station that's in orbit. And I was just like, this is not real, this is a movie. And they're like, no, it's real, watch. And for the first time watching on the TV, saw those 2 huge solid rocket boosters ignite, and then the 3 shuttle main engines as it lifted off from 39A, historic launch pad 39A, and was like, this is just out of this world. This isn't real. This is sci-fi. And my dad grabs me and goes, here, come here. And we go out to the backyard, and a couple of seconds after it lifted off from the TV, we were able to see it from my backyard, because
Wow.
we live about 2 hours from Kennedy Space Center. So uh, that was definitely, I think, the day I can look back on and really remember that that was the day that ignited my fire, my passion. I went right back into my room, and that little styrofoam plane that I was playing with all of a sudden became a space shuttle when I turned it up right. And for I'm 19 years old now, and for the past 14 years, there hasn't been a single day that's gone by where I haven't dreamed of flying and going to space and being around the aerospace community and being around, rockets, and really kind of experiencing the real world as almost sci-fi, like I thought when I was a kid. And I can't say anything other than that. It's like I feel like a kid when I'm around these things.
Wow, man, gave me goosebumps listening to that story. Just to hear that you watched it on TV and walked outside and it was right there, like in real life, like it made it tangible for you, and that's absolutely amazing.
Absolutely.
So, when did you start photographing rockets? When did you finally pull your camera out and start capturing these things?
So I got hired at Clearwater Marine Aquarium in 2016. I would say probably 2 years into it. At a point, I was like starting to follow other rocket photographers, starting to follow the things that were happening not only in the aerospace community but in the photography community in general. Um, and I was like, okay, I need to go back over to the other coast and watch a rocket launch, photograph a rocket launch, because there are people like John Krause, Eric Kuna. You got all these big names that are out there taking these photographs of rockets, and they look unreal, bringing it back to that sci-fi element that looks like sci-fi. Um, and I hadn't been to Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral, Port Canaveral. I hadn't been over on that coast for a rocket launch since 2010 at that point, which was the last space shuttle I ever went and saw, Space Shuttle Atlantis. Um, and Falcon Heavy was coming up. The demonstration launch of Falcon Heavy, and that was kind of the first time that SpaceX had really caught my eye. Um, Earlier in 2016, 2017, when they started doing their research and development around Falcon landings, and they made the first Falcon 9 landing at LZ1, and then about a month later on, Of Course I Still Love You. That I think kind of caught the eye of the public, so that was something I couldn't escape. But Falcon Heavy was like, what is SpaceX? What is Falcon Heavy? I needed to know every single little detail. Um, so I kind of obsessed over that for about 6 months, and then finally in February of 2018, launch day came around, and I made the trip out there and photographed Falcon Heavy from about 12 miles away from the launch pad, and was like hooked again. That same passion, that same fire I had felt at 5 years old. There it was, photographing 27 Merlin engines lifting off from that same launch pad 39A was incredible. And I was like, I need to do this right now. Every possibility, every opportunity I get, I need to do this. So for about a year after that, every launch I could make it out to, I made it out to. And at the time, I didn't own my own DSLR, so every little penny I could scrape up from work to rent a camera from my local renting company. I was renting DSLRs and taking them out there to the other coast to capture rockets. So I did that for about a year.
Wow, man. So for listeners that may not know much about aerospace, can you explain what Falcon Heavy is? Like you said, the Merlin engines, but and how many there were, but can you just explain a little bit more about Falcon Heavy and what that is?
Yeah, sure. So Falcon Heavy is the world's largest operational rocket. In 2018, it made its demonstration flight, which is that mission I was just talking about. Um, it might be recognizable to viewers as the rocket that lifted Elon Musk's cherry red Tesla Roadster into space on. I know that became quite a famous image. Um, Falcon Heavy is essentially three of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rockets, which they use on a regular basis, and they take three of those Falcon 9s and they strap them together to make one huge rocket that actually beats out the capabilities of other rockets in the world by about a factor of two. Um, and it uses 27 first stage engines that all ignite at one time to lift hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds of payload into space. And it's definitely a feat of engineering and of human capability. SpaceX does rocketry, does aerospace, does technology differently than any other company in the world. And the thing that makes Falcon Heavy so distinct between it and any other rocket, other than its powerful lifting capabilities, is the fact that it's about 80% reusable. Uh, the two side boosters that make it so synonymous as the heavy lift launch vehicle, those boosters actually do a flip in orbit. They ignite their engines about three more times, and they're able to come down back to Earth, back to Kennedy Space Center, and land. And then the center core performs a similar maneuver and lands out on a drone ship out of the water. So that's essentially three rockets all strapped together that all can turn themselves around, re-enter Earth's atmosphere at supersonic speeds, and land to be reused again.
Land backwards,
Which
in
is
fact.
backwards. Yep, engines first,
Engines.
which is a weird way when you especially look at the physics of how atmospheric reentry and thermodynamics and aerodynamics work on a rocket or on any sort of aircraft. It's weird the way they're able to land these things, because physically they shouldn't, but they do.
Yeah, it's absolutely magnificent. If you haven't seen one of these rocket launches, just go on YouTube, look one up. It's insane. And just to hear the staff and at SpaceX just go crazy and erupt in applause and like start yelling and hollering, like that's the greatest thing ever. They're so excited about it.
Well, and that's an element that SpaceX in recent years has really brought to the aerospace community, is this essence of, it's almost like going and watching sports games.
Yeah.
It's, launch providers are now your favorite football team, and when they launch, they're competing, and if they can get the payload into orbit, that's like winning the Super Bowl. It's awesome. It's the best.
It's amazing. So you were about 12 miles away, right?
For the original Falcon Heavy, yes.
Yeah.
I was about 12 miles away. I was actually standing on the Max Brewer Bridge with my rental camera, taking pictures of it.
So going into this, what kind of research did you do? Were you looking at, did you know of people like Eric Kuna? I mean, obviously you did. So were you looking at his stuff and John Krause's stuff? And were you like, how were you figuring out how to shoot these things?
Any way I could, really. I was doing a lot of research at the time, just about space. Like I said, with the launch of Falcon Heavy coming up, that was something that really kind of reignited that aerospace passion in me, especially around rockets. So I was just kind of getting re-involved into the community and into the world of rockets, and trying to figure out every little detail I could. And like you mentioned, photographers like Eric Kuna and John Krause and the guys over at NASA Spaceflight and America Space, Mike Killian, a bunch of these guys, their content became unavoidable at that point, and specifically using resources like Ben Cooper and Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut, using resources like those guys. I did every bit of research I could to prepare for what kind of exposure I needed for the engines of the rocket, because even in the daytime, it's like shooting the sun because those engines are so bright. Trying to figure out how, what the exposure settings should be, what different ways I could change the composition of the photo so it just wasn't looking down a camera at a rocket and having it be, just a couple of pixels of the frame, and really doing everything I could to make sure that this first time shooting a rocket with a professional camera, with a DSLR, wasn't just like taking cell phone pictures of it.
Yeah, definitely. So what lens did you use to capture the Falcon Heavy?
So at the time, the only lens I had was a 7-200 f4 lens that I had also rented with the camera. So Falcon Heavy wasn't super prominent in the shots, and unfortunately, I did kind of mess up my exposure a little bit, anyways, because we were out at the launch pad for not at the launch pad, at the bridge. We were waiting next to the launch pad for about 6 hours that day.
Wow.
They had quite a large launch window for that particular mission, and they decided to push all the way to the end of the mission. So, as daytime usually does, the lighting changed, and my settings were set for about 4 hours earlier. But that's part of the learning experience. So definitely learned that 200 millimeters is not enough to shoot a rocket from about 12 miles away.
So yeah, what are some tips, some settings that you could share with the audience if they want to get into rocket photography? Like what do you have to do to capture one of these things?
You could do rocket photography a lot of different ways, for sure. My biggest mistake at that particular point was thinking that 200 millimeters was 600 or 800 millimeters, and thinking I could just take pictures of the rocket itself, which was a mistake. The thing about taking photographs of rockets is, yes, they are beautiful in and of themselves, but they also add a lot of crazy sci-fi like inspirational context to the world around them. If you haven't been to the east coast of Florida near Merritt Island and Port Canaveral, that it's a really gorgeous place, and there's really gorgeous things in nature and human industry that is out there. So my tip to anybody who would want to take on rocket photography, especially as an amateur, would be use the world around you as context and show the rocket within that crazy context that you're standing in. If you're able to afford the expensive gear, because as we all know, as freelance photographers, it is not a cheap hobby. Using a DSLR with a decent lens, I would say about 300 millimeters in focal length or more. Shoot the rocket from as close as you can, because that's where all the action is as close as you possibly can get. At least it is for me. And like I mentioned earlier, it's like taking pictures of the sun. The engines on these things, liquid-fueled engines, especially the solid rocket engines, they get really, really bright. So a thing that I have come to learn, especially over the past year and a half of shooting them as a member of the media and being extremely close to the rockets and having remote cameras set up next to the launch pads, is underexposing and shooting in RAW is your friend. Because once you get these photos back into Lightroom and you're able to kind of pull back some of that detail in the raw image, can really bring out some crazy things. Engine shots, like you see coming from the launch pads, where it's just the rocket engines in frame, and the crazy detail coming from the fire being emitted by the engines. You really have to kind of make your pictures dark, make them really dark, and bring those details back later. Post editing is a must when you're shooting rockets, for sure.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So how do you find the locations that you're going to shoot from? Like, do you have like friends that you go out and shoot with? Do you have a group of people, like, or is it just you?
It depends. I do have friends out on the Space Coast that I like to go and hang out with every once in a while. I don't necessarily prioritize being with them as opposed to getting the shot if I do have a shot idea. It makes it easy having remote cameras out on the launch pad, because there's only specific areas of the launch pad where we can set up those remote cameras. So as far as contextually where is the camera, that's kind of limited, and forces you to get creative about what kind of shot you're going to do to change it up from the last time or from other people's shots, per se. When shooting from public locations out on the Space Coast, especially for people trying to get into it, there's a lot of different places where you can go and see a launch, but there's very few where you can go and see a launch close. So that kind of limits your options. And for nighttime launches, that scale becomes a whole lot wider, because you're able to see the rocket from a whole lot further at nighttime. That bright light just emulates in the sky like a second sun at nighttime. I can't stress that enough. It is bright. So being able to kind of use the state of Florida to your advantage at that point gives you a whole lot more options for foreground imagery and the things that you're going to use in your photo, for sure.
Definitely. So when did the website come into play? When did you start doing blogs and things like that?
So the website kind of came into play about a year and a half ago now, right at the beginning of 2019. About a year ago. Right at the beginning of 2019, I had been following some of these other sites for a long time now, and was just finding my passion in the never stopping news cycle around the rockets and around the photographs that were coming out of these rockets, and decided that shooting the rockets from Max Brewer Bridge and from Port Canaveral, about 14 miles away, 12 miles away. It was close, but it wasn't close enough, and so I was determined to get out and stand next to one of the rockets as close as I possibly could, and try and expand my art form, like some of these other guys are. So at that point, I started a blog called HoverSlamPhotography.com. The name HoverSlam comes from the Falcon Heavy rocket and also the Falcon 9s that come back to Earth and perform a landing maneuver called the suicide burn, or also known as the HoverSlam, which is that final engine burn that slows the rocket down from about 400 miles an hour to 0 miles an hour right as it touches the ground within a matter of about 10 seconds. So that's where the name comes from. And I started HoverSlam Photography as a blog covering my personal adventures around rocket photography and the news that was coming out of the Space Coast from NASA and SpaceX and launch providers like ULA and Blue Origin, and really tried to pursue the news and media cycle in a different aspect than anyone else was, and it really all kind of came to a head when I applied for my first NASASocial, which is how I met you back in back in April of 2019 for the CRS-17 mission, which really motivated me to push HoverSlam to the next level, and kind of made me realize that this was a good area of career to follow, is covering these rockets and being around them as much as possible.
So tell me about your experience at the CRS-17 launch, because I unfortunately didn't actually get to see it because they delayed it for like 5 days and I had to leave.
That's right.
So
Yep.
What was that experience like for you after going to a NASA social?
Well, that was crazy. That was definitely another big milestone moment for me, because up until that point, that was the closest I had ever been to a rocket at liftoff. We were about 3 miles away from the 3 or 4 miles away from the launch pad, out at the NASA Causeway, where the NASASocial crew let us out for the launch pad near Space Launch Complex 40, and it was gorgeous. It was a little bit of a stressful week, like you had mentioned up until that point, because we had the NASASocial at the beginning of the week and had this awesome day and a half out there at Kennedy Space Center, going behind the scenes and seeing the facilities and getting to do all this crazy wild stuff in the lead up to launch, and then having to kind of play a sit and wait game for the rocket to finally lift off, because of different conditions that kept coming up. But being out there, I think it was about 1 o'clock in the morning when CRS-17 finally got off the launch pad, and being out under the clear black sky of the Florida nighttime and seeing this Falcon 9 just absolutely turn night into day, and create this crazy artwork in the sky, was again a huge milestone for me, and being that close only drove that passion, that fire inside me further, and I was blown away by the opportunity and by the things I was able to see and the photos I was able to capture.
And for those of you listening, the NASASocial is basically an event where they get people from all over, from all different walks of life. They basically put a tweet out, or they post a blog or whatever, saying that they're inviting social creators to come out to NASA and explore behind the scenes. So I applied I saw a tweet. I got referred to a tweet, and somebody was like, you need to go to this. You have to go check this out. So how did you apply? How did you hear about the NASASocial?
No, that was pretty much the same exact experience for me. Following kind of space Twitter and being around the community online, across my timeline came a tweet from the NASA Twitter page that said, "Hey, social media users, we're inviting you out to come and experience the launch of a Falcon 9 with a Cargo Dragon payload towards the International Space Station. And we're inviting you out to be social media members of our NASASocial and be credentialed and come and have this crazy opportunity. And it was an opportunity that I couldn't pass, especially with having the blog and trying to go the direction I was trying to go in with my career. It seemed like they were literally telling me, "Hey, Brandon, these are your first steps. Come on over, take them." And within the first day of seeing that tweet, filled out the application, filled out everything I could, and poured all my energy into trying to make that happen.
Yeah, I made a video, so as well. Like when I saw the tweet, I was like, I got to make a video to NASA and tell them I have to be there.
Right.
I did everything I could, and it turned out to be super cool because there were supposed to be like 50 people there, and there were only like 23 of us?
Yeah, I was very surprised. It was a very tight-knit group that ended up actually going, and then that group only got smaller and smaller as the launch delays happened. So by launch night, by the time the rocket actually got off the pad, there was maybe 10 of us.
Wow, that's amazing. So what have you been doing over the past year since the NASASocial? How has your career path grown? How has your business grown?
Oh man, it's been a crazy year. It doesn't feel like it's been a year. It feels like it's been maybe a week since the Sierra 17 social. But no, I've been staying busy. I've been working on my photography game, trying to step it up in any way I can, and keep developing those skills as any good photographer does. And I've also tried to expand my brand as a news and media resource around the spaceflight community. So shortly after the Sierra 17 NASASocial that we went to, HoverSlam Photography became the identity for the freelance photography aspect of my business, and the blog transitioned into a full-on news website called HoverSlamSpace.com. And I pursued further media activities with launch providers and agencies like NASA and SpaceX and United Launch Alliance as a full-on member of the media, and tried to get attention to myself and my brand as much as I possibly could, and applied to everything as much as I possibly could. And the big turning stone for me was shortly after my second NASASocial, which I attended in July of 2019 for the Orion Ascent Abort test, which we all missed you out there, by the way.
I got to get out to the next one.
Listen, definitely. Let me know if you're coming over.
Sure.
Shortly after that NASASocial, I had actually reached out to United Launch Alliance on Twitter and directly added them and asked, is there going to be a social for your upcoming Atlas V launch that you guys are going to be having? And if there isn't, how can I apply for media credentials? And called out ULA on Twitter, as well as CEO Tori Bruno, who's a really awesome guy and likes to interact with social media users. And somebody from the ULA social media team reached back out to me and said, if you're serious, here's your application. Here's where you find your application for media credentials with the 45th Space Wing at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. And go ahead and fill out your application. I drop it to them, and we'll see how things go. So on a whim, not thinking that my credentials would get accepted at all, just as a two-time NASASocial alumni, and at that point kind of amateur blogger, submitted my application to the 45th Space Wing as a member of the media, and within a couple of weeks got an email that said I had been accepted and had a year's worth of credentials at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station under my belt, and that any launch going from Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, I was now a full member of the media that had access. And not gonna lie, I got a little emotional that day. That was pretty cool. That was a goal that I had set for myself to obtain within a year or 2 years, not within a matter of months. And I definitely took it and ran with it. So now I'm trying to do the same thing, essentially trying to promote and expand the brand wherever I can. But also on a more professional level. I'm out at the Space Coast whenever I can get over there to cover the latest and breaking news that's coming out of some of these agencies like NASA and ULA and SpaceX, and cover the launches as a member of the media, but also as a photographer who's trying to express his art. So it's cool. It's best of both worlds for sure.
So let's talk about making money with this photography. How does that work in your field? So talk to me about, working with agencies, things like that, and how people can get in touch with them.
Sure. So that's kind of a multi-layered question. So to start with the making money, that's a little bit of a difficult process. That does take time. If you ask any other launch photographers, they'll tell you the same thing. It's not an easy sell. We don't get paid to go out and cover these rocket launches as members of the media, so there's no steady paycheck. I think as any other content creator, as you would know, you have to really have an entrepreneurial spirit when approaching these things if you do want to try and make money from them. So money comes from selling your photos, selling prints, selling digital downloads, selling brand opportunities, or licensing your artwork or your photos or your writing talents to other major outlets. It also comes from advertising and like I said, merchandising where you can, for sure, which isn't necessarily a huge fun part of the job, because if I could just give everyone my photos for free and share them with the world, and have my photos hung up on people's walls without having to charge them money, that would be an ideal world. But it's an expensive hobby, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. It's like people don't understand how difficult it is to make money as a freelance photographer, and so I just wanted you to tell them a little bit more about that, so I appreciate that. So let's talk about the agency side.
So yeah, working with the different agencies, it's a fun process, because it's a lot of different people that you get to interact with and see how the inner workings of these major companies work. Some of them are they have a little bit more of a simple process than others. I think NASA, being a a government organization, has a lot of moving parts, a lot of mechanisms that you have to interact with if you do want to become a member of the media, and which in turn makes them the most challenging to get credentials from. Especially as a newer member of the media community, it becomes a challenge sometimes to receive full media credentials per launch, because they, unlike Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, they do give media credentials on a per mission basis. So Cape Canaveral Air Force Space Station, or Cape Canaveral Space Station, or Space Force Station as it's now called, because the sixth branch of the military just got established. So that's a challenge. I keep calling it Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. It's Space Force Station. They credential their media team for about a year. So I've had my credentials for about 8 months, and they'll expire in 3 or 4 months now, and at which point I will have to simply just reapply. So I don't think that'll be a challenge at that point. Which that application allows you on the base, but you do also have to communicate with the agencies that operate on that base. So communicating with SpaceX, their media team directly, communicating with United Launch Alliance and their media team directly. And once we get some of these other launch providers like Firefly Aerospace and Blue Origin operating out of that side of the property and utilizing their launch pads, it'll be a similar process where you get added to a media list, and you communicate with the team as much as possible on when these missions are coming up, when they're going to happen, how they're going to happen, getting schedules for remote camera setups and press conference opportunities, and really just trying to follow up as much as you can. So I would say it's all about communication, and it's all about uh, being able to work with a lot of people within the industry.
Very cool. So, one of your photos just got shared by Fox Orlando. Can you talk about that feature and what that means for you?
Yeah, so that was a pretty cool opportunity. Like I mentioned earlier, NASA gives out their credentials on a mission by mission basis, and unfortunately for yesterday's historic mission of the SpaceX in-flight abort test, I wasn't able to snag credentials for Kennedy Space Center. So I kind of had to work with what I had and figure out a game plan, and that game plan became returning to the Max Brewer Bridge, which I had shot the first Falcon Heavy from, and trying to take some cool photos of the abort test, and still being able to cover it for my website. So traveled out there last night in the early morning hours, and watched this crazy launch slash fireworks show slash important astronaut test occur. And quickly, once the abort test had finished up, edited one of my photos quickly on my iPad and got it posted up to Twitter, and realized that my point of view from the Max Brewer Bridge was about one of the only points of view where you could actually see the explosion of the Falcon 9 first stage occur. Everyone who had media credentials and was shooting from Kennedy Space Center, whether it be right there on the press site or on the top of the vehicle assembly building or somewhere else on site, the rocket became obscured by a layer of clouds. So my photos, being one of the only few media resources um, to have that point of view, that aspect of the Falcon 9 first stage exploding midair, that photo quickly gained traction online and became highly noticed. And within about 2 hours of being posted on social media, I had the Fox 35 Orlando team reach out to me and ask me if it was okay if my photo was featured in a online news article as well as on televised press pieces,
What?
which was a pretty cool opportunity. So,
Whoa.
my yeah, yeah, that was a rush for sure. Which it's one thing when you're running your own media website and you're publishing your own photos, but for a huge media outlet like Fox to reach out and ask if they could use your photos because you're one of the few to only capture it, that was pretty neat for sure.
Dude, I cannot wait to see what happens next for you after hearing about this. That's amazing, and congratulations, like massive congratulations to you for that.
Thank you, and I got to shout out Space Coast Stephen Marr for Next Horizon Spaceflight, who was out there at the Max Brewer Bridge with me and had to leave quickly um, for some personal obligations he had already had. He made a stop once he realized that the Falcon was actually going to be lifting off that yesterday morning, and grabbed a quick picture, which also got featured in the same article, as well as Stargal, who their photos actually got featured in that same article as well. They got some excellent shots. Stargal was actually Star Shattered was actually out on the Starfleet Tours boat, which was out in the Atlantic Ocean, just adjacent to where the Falcon 9 blew up, and they got some really cool pictures of it as well. So I just got to go ahead and shout them out as well because they're in that same article.
Definitely.
They did a
And
great job.
thank you for shouting them out as well. It's awesome of you to do. So, What's next for you, man? What do you want to do? What do you want to do now? What are you working on
Oh
now?
man, I'm working on some big things. I'm working on my freelance photography here in the Tampa Bay area. So my passion is taking pictures of rockets, but other than that, I love taking pictures of people and of nature and of the world around me. So I'm working on some big things here locally as far as taking pictures, doing some portrait photography, event photography. Got some clients that are lined up for that, and then other than that, I'm putting all of my time and effort into expanding the HoverSlam brand as far as HoverSlamSpace.com goes, and trying to bring as much content in 2020 as I possibly can to the spaceflight community. But the big goal, the really big goal for HoverSlam Space this year is to not only build the brand, but to build a community. I think a lot of people online and in the world in general are kind of obscure to the things that are happening here on the Space Coast and in the world of spaceflight. And I think it's a very important aspect of today's society. A lot of the things that companies like SpaceX and NASA are doing, returning humans, returning American astronauts back into orbit on American rockets, is happening this year, and that is a huge milestone for us as a country. And on a bigger scale picture, making human life, making humans a multiplanetary species, taking us to Mars and further out into the solar system, is it's a realistic goal. It's not just in the movies. It's not just in the TV shows. It's not just a dream. It's companies like SpaceX and NASA are putting resources and development and money and time and effort and people into making those goals a reality. And it's something that's unfolding now. We have rockets that are being developed, such as the SpaceX Starship, which is going to be an absolutely revolutionary piece of technology when it comes to aerospace. And I think bringing attention to the things that are going on and how important this aspect of technology and science is to society as a whole is definitely a huge goal of mine, and trying to inspire people, especially the younger demographic, with the photographs and the art that I'm able to capture is definitely the number one drive for 2020.
Awesome. And so I'm on your website and I see that you have an availability at the bottom. What are you guys looking for on your team?
Oh man, that's a loaded question. Photographers, videographers, writers, editors, content creators. Period. We are looking for expanding the team, looking for people who are passionate and are capable of covering space flight in any way, shape, or form. Whether it's writing articles, creating videos, creating photo content. If you are able to bring something to the table for HoverSlamSpace.com, we're looking for you.
Well, if you ever need anything out west, I hope you hit me up because we don't have as frequent of launches out here, but we still got them, and I would love to do some stuff with you guys.
I would love to. I would love to do that. I will for sure pursue that with you. That sounds amazing, and would love nothing else for sure.
So my final question for you is, what is something you know now that you wish you knew when you started?
That is a very interesting question. Man, what is something I know now that I wish I knew when I started? Um, I think if it's one thing I know now that I wish I knew then, it's how much of a tight knit community the spaceflight media community really is. You see a lot of these people interact with each other on social media and talk back and forth, even though they represent different websites, different media teams, different walks of life. When we all come together and we're able to share this combined experience of human capability, it really does bring us all together in a way where it's very friendly, and you get to know these people on a personal level, and it's such a tight knit group. And sometimes we represent different businesses, or some people might look at it as a competition, or however you want to look at it. At the end of the day, we're all there supporting each other, and the community as a whole is just fantastic. And at first, when I first started, I was kind of shy to get involved and to talk to people and to kind of get my name out there, but there's absolutely no reason for that in this particular niche community, because everyone is fantastic. Everyone is really great and helpful. So
awesome, man. And if people want to reach out to you for either some work, or if an agency might want to reach out to you, where can they get in touch with you, and how can they find you on social media?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at HoverSlam Space, or at HSlam Photography, or HoverSlam Photography. On Instagram, I am at Brandon H Slam, and at HoverSlam Space. You can also reach me by email at admin@hoverslamspace.com, or by phone at 727-440-5825.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much for coming on Project Freelance. I had a blast catching up with you, and I think we should definitely catch up sooner rather than later again.
Absolutely. Yeah, this was awesome. This was a really cool opportunity for sure. I was excited when you reached out.
So, what did you think of this episode of Project Freelance? We have now had Eric Kuna on the podcast, and we've had Brandon on the podcast. I think we're going to reach out to John Krause and talk to him about rocket photography next. I loved doing this podcast. Brandon was so nice in person, and after following him on social media and seeing his stuff, I really knew that I wanted to reach out to him and talk to him more about what he does as a rocket photographer and a freelancer. So that was a really cool episode for me, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did like this episode of Project Freelance, please do me a favor and give the podcast a rating and some feedback. That helps me grow this podcast, and it helps us reach a broader audience so that more people can hear about these tips and tricks for freelancing, and for if, hey, you want to get into rocket photography, this podcast probably gave you a lot of really helpful information. It definitely helped me out a lot, and I feel more prepared for when I actually do get to shoot a rocket. Thank you for listening to Project Freelance this week. I will talk to you guys next week on the podcast. If you haven't checked out the links in the description yet, please go down there and check those out. All of Brandon's links will be down in the description as well for you guys if you want to get in touch with him. So thank you again for listening to Project Freelance. If you want to support the podcast, you can go to patreon.com/justtheletterk. The link will be down in the description. And if you want to pick up one of my books, No Tracers, an Urban Explorer's Diary, it's full of photos and stories of my urban exploration tales, and it was so fun to make, and I want you to read it. I want you to get a copy of it. So yeah, if you guys want to check out my photography and support what I do, head to justtheletterk.com/no tracers. Like I said, again, the links will be down in the description. Thank you guys. I'll talk to you next week. Stay strong, keep enduring, go out and go create something.